For nearly 300 years, a single law remained quietly alive inside the legal system, even though almost no one knew it still existed. It was not hidden behind secrecy or protected by power. It survived because of something far simpler and far more human: neglect. When the law was first written, the world was very different. Life moved slowly. Traditions ruled daily behavior, and authority depended heavily on written orders. Lawmakers believed that once a rule was written, approved, and sealed, it would naturally shape society forever. They believed permanence was strength. They believed that words on paper could control the future. At that moment in history, that belief made sense. The law was created during a period of anxiety. Leaders felt that order was slipping away, that people were behaving in ways that threatened stability. In response, they wrote rules quickly, sometimes without fully understanding how society would change. This particular law focused on a very specific behavior that seemed dangerous or unacceptable at the time. It was strict, detailed, and deeply connected to the social structure of that era. When it was introduced, people noticed it. Some followed it out of fear, some out of habit, and some simply because questioning authority was rare. For a short time, the law appeared to work. But history never stays still. Slowly, the conditions that made the law necessary began to disappear. Technology changed how people lived. Social values shifted. New priorities replaced old fears. What once felt like a serious threat became irrelevant. The behavior the law tried to control no longer mattered in the same way. Yet the law itself remained unchanged. No one revised it. No one questioned it publicly. It simply stayed where it was, frozen in time while the world moved forward without it. As the years passed, enforcement weakened. Officials stopped mentioning the law because applying it caused confusion. It no longer fit real life. Judges avoided it because using it felt unreasonable and outdated. Citizens stopped caring because the law no longer matched their reality. There was no announcement, no repeal, no public debate. The law did not end dramatically, it faded. And fading is more powerful than resistance. When people stop talking about something, it begins to lose its existence. Children were born and grew up without ever hearing about the law. Adults lived full lives without once being affected by it. Entire generations passed in complete ignorance of its presence, and yet, legally, it was still there, written, approved, valid. This is how a law can exist and not exist at the same time. It becomes a ghost within the system, technically alive, but socially dead. What makes this story unusual is not that people ignored the law, but that everyone ignored it together. This was not rebellion. There were no protests, no movements demanding change. Instead, there was a silent agreement between society and authority. Enforcing the law would create more problems than it solved, so it was easier to pretend it was not there. Over time, pretending became normal. Normal became tradition. Tradition became permanence. The law remained untouched, not because it was respected, but because it was inconvenient. Decades passed, then a century, then another. Governments changed, rulers fell, new systems replaced old ones, wars were fought, borders moved, technology transformed communication, transportation, and daily life. Yet somewhere in a forgotten legal archive, the law continued to exist exactly as it was written hundreds of years earlier. It survived revolutions not because it was powerful, but because it was invisible. Occasionally, historians and legal researchers studying old documents would stumble upon the law. At first, they assumed it had been repealed long ago. Surely no society could allow something so outdated to remain valid. But when they searched for evidence of its removal, they found nothing. No repeal, no amendment, no official cancellation. The law had simply been ignored for centuries. This discovery created discomfort. It revealed a flaw in the system. If the law was still valid, then technically millions of people had been breaking it for generations without consequence. This raised uncomfortable questions. What gives a law its power? Is it the writing, the authority behind it, or the willingness of people to follow it? If no one enforces a rule, is it still a rule, or is it just ink pretending to matter? The forgotten law exposed a truth that many systems prefer to ignore. Authority without relevance is fragile. Control without belief is an illusion. When modern officials finally became aware of the law, the reaction was not anger or urgency, it was embarrassment. Enforcing the law would be absurd. Punishing people for centuries of ignored behavior would destroy trust. Ignoring it any longer would expose incompetence. The law had trapped the system in a corner. The only logical solution was to remove it quietly. The process of ending the law was surprisingly simple. A short discussion, a vote, a signature. In a matter of minutes, a rule that had existed for nearly 300 years was officially erased. There was no celebration, no outrage, no visible change in daily life. And yet something important had happened. The system had admitted that silence had replaced authority for centuries. The forgotten law became a lesson rather than a failure. It showed that laws are not immortal. They survive only as long as they reflect reality. When reality changes and authority refuses to adapt, neglect takes over. Silence becomes reform. People do not always fight bad rules. Sometimes they simply stop noticing them. And when enough people stop noticing something, it loses its power. This story also reveals something deeply human. People are not naturally rebellious. Most do not seek conflict with authority, but they also do not blindly follow rules that no longer make sense. When faced with outdated control, society often chooses the easiest path, not resistance, not obedience, but quiet avoidance. Over time, avoidance becomes normal. Normal becomes tradition. Tradition becomes permanence. The law remained untouched, not because it was respected, but because it was inconvenient. The law did not fail because people were disobedient. It failed because it outlived its purpose. Instead of being corrected, it was ignored. That neglect became its legacy. 300 years of quiet defiance, without speeches, without movements, without leaders, just ordinary people living ordinary lives as if the law did not exist. History often celebrates loud moments, revolutions, wars, declarations, but some of the most important changes happen quietly, in archives, in silence, in forgotten pages. This law is proof that history is not only shaped by action, but also by inaction, by what societies choose not to enforce, by what institutions choose not to see. In the end, the law mattered more as a warning than it ever did as a rule.
In the quiet corners of history, there are countless laws that once seemed urgent and essential, but were eventually forgotten. One such law existed for centuries, never truly enforced, yet never officially repealed. Its existence is a reminder that laws, like people, can age, decay, and eventually become invisible. The law was created in a period where authority depended heavily on paper. Rules were assumed to be powerful simply because they were written. A signature, a seal, and an official declaration were thought to guarantee obedience. Leaders believed that human behavior could be shaped by documents alone. This assumption, while reasonable at the time, would prove to be naive as history unfolded. The world was changing faster than any lawmaker could predict, and yet the law remained, frozen in the ink of its creation. When the law was introduced, society was tense. Leaders feared disorder, and they believed that strict rules were necessary to maintain stability. The law targeted a very specific human behavior that seemed threatening or immoral. It was detailed, precise, and appeared essential for the proper functioning of society. For a time, it was taken seriously. People complied, whether out of fear, habit, or respect for authority. Courts referred to it occasionally, and officials kept it in mind. It was, in many ways, a product of its time, a reflection of the anxieties, priorities, and values of that historical moment. But history moves forward, and conditions evolve. Within decades, the reason for the law began to fade. The behavior it sought to control became less relevant. Social values shifted. Technology and commerce transformed daily life. Practices that had seemed dangerous were now normal. The law, however, did not adapt. It remained intact, a relic of a past era. It was still enforceable on paper, yet entirely disconnected from reality. People stopped paying attention, not out of rebellion, but because the law no longer intersected meaningfully with their lives. Authority itself began to ignore it, recognizing that enforcement would be disruptive and absurd. As generations passed, the law sank further into obscurity. Children grew up without hearing about it, adults lived full lives never affected by it, and scholars overlooked it because it no longer appeared relevant. Despite this, the law remained legally valid. It existed in archives, in official records, waiting silently to be rediscovered. The contrast between its legal validity and practical irrelevance illustrates a critical point about human systems. A law does not need to be obeyed to exist. Its existence is independent of action, but its power depends entirely on acknowledgement and enforcement. The remarkable aspect of this forgotten law is not merely that it was ignored, but that it was ignored universally. Society, in effect, participated in a silent agreement. No one challenged the law actively, and no one questioned its validity publicly. Officials chose to look away, citizens chose to ignore it, and gradually, collective neglect became the norm. This was not an act of defiance, but a pragmatic choice. Enforcing an obsolete rule would have created chaos. Disregarding it maintained stability. In time, pretending that the law did not exist became habitual. Habit evolved into tradition, and tradition solidified the law's invisibility. The law's obscurity did not make it irrelevant from a historical perspective. When historians eventually discovered it while examining old records, they were initially incredulous. How could a law survive for centuries without any enforcement? How could society function while technically violating a law for generations? The legal texts were clear. The law was still valid. No repeal, no amendment, no official notice of invalidation existed. The discovery shocked scholars and revealed the tension between written authority and lived reality. Laws, after all, exist not only to regulate behavior, but also to signal the legitimacy of institutions. When laws are ignored, they expose the fragility of the systems that uphold them. Officials who learned of the law faced an awkward dilemma. Enforcing it would have been ridiculous. Punishing people for centuries of ignored behavior would have been impossible, and pretending it did not exist any longer risked exposing institutional incompetence. The law had, in effect, trapped the authorities in a paradox. It existed by definition, but had no real-world application. The only viable solution was to remove it quietly, with minimal notice and disruption. This process took little time: a meeting, a vote, a signature, and just like that, 3 centuries of legal existence ended in a matter of minutes. No grand ceremonies, no public debates, no dramatic fanfare. The law vanished quietly, leaving behind only lessons and questions. This story teaches profound lessons about the nature of law, authority, and human behavior. First, laws are not immortal. They endure only as long as they remain relevant to those they govern. When a law outlives its context, neglect becomes inevitable. Second, obedience is not automatic. People do not follow rules blindly. They follow rules that make sense within their lived reality. Third, silence can be more powerful than action. Generations of citizens and officials quietly ignoring the law achieved the same effect that rebellion or reform might have, effectively nullifying it without confrontation. In many ways, the law's invisibility was its undoing. Beyond the technical lessons, the forgotten law also highlights human pragmatism. People are not naturally defiant, but they are practical. When enforcement becomes impractical or absurd, society tends to find ways to adapt. The law remained in the records, but the world evolved around it. Citizens acted as though it did not exist. Officials administered life as though it did not exist. In doing so, they created a form of order more durable than any official edict could have imposed. The system worked, not because the law was respected, but because people recognized the futility of enforcing it. The story also demonstrates how history remembers the overlooked. Dramatic events, wars, revolutions, assassinations, dominate narratives. Yet the most revealing aspects of human behavior often come from what is ignored, avoided, or silently subverted. The forgotten law, ignored for 3 centuries, tells us more about practical human governance than thousands of pages of treaties or official records. It shows how societies manage obsolete authority without collapse, how culture mediates between written rules and real behavior, and how human systems rely on adaptation rather than rigid enforcement. When the law was eventually repealed, the act itself was almost unnoticed. It did not disrupt society, because society had long since stopped considering it. Yet the repeal marked an acknowledgement that the law's original purpose had vanished. It symbolized the end of centuries of implicit negotiation between written authority and practical behavior. In retrospect, the law had already failed silently long before it was formally abolished. Its final abolition was merely a formality, an official recognition of a reality that existed for generations. The forgotten law remains a powerful metaphor for the intersection of power, relevance, and obedience. Written authority alone cannot sustain compliance. Rules must evolve with society, where they become hollow. Human behavior is not dictated solely by what is written, but by what is perceived as meaningful. The law's history reminds us that obedience and authority are dynamic, negotiated, and contingent, not static or automatic. Furthermore, the law exemplifies the subtlety of historical influence. Not all changes are marked by dramatic acts or obvious shifts. Sometimes, the slow erosion of relevance, coupled with collective neglect, produces outcomes as significant as any revolution. 300 years of inaction did more to nullify the law than a single decree could have. Inaction here becomes a form of power,
demonstrating that what is ignored can shape history as much as what is enforced. In examining the law, historians also learn about the resilience of bureaucratic systems. Institutions can sustain obsolete rules without collapse. Legal frameworks are robust in some ways, flexible in others. They can accommodate neglect while maintaining overall stability. The law's survival for centuries, even in disuse, shows how human systems balance rigidity and adaptation. It demonstrates that governance does not require perfection, only functionality. And sometimes functionality depends on ignoring what no longer matters. At last, the story of the forgotten law challenges assumptions about law, authority, and compliance. It reminds us that the presence of a rule does not guarantee obedience, that legal validity does not ensure relevance, and that societies can function without fully respecting written authority. It teaches us that history is shaped as much by what people choose to ignore as by what they actively enforce. And it proves that silence, continuity, and adaptation are forces just as powerful as legislation, protest, or revolution. 300 years of quiet, unnoticed, and largely irrelevant existence created a narrative more.
History is full of laws and rules that once seemed indispensable, but gradually faded into obscurity. And among them, some survived not because they were enforced, but because they were forgotten. One such law existed quietly for centuries, an unassuming relic of a time when authority relied on the written word above all else. When it was created, it carried the weight of importance, a reflection of the anxieties, priorities, and values of the era. The lawmakers assumed that because it was written, approved, and signed, it would shape human behavior automatically. They believed permanence on paper would translate to permanence in practice. But as history often shows, permanence is a fragile illusion. The law was born during a period of uncertainty. Leaders feared disorder, social disruption, and behaviors they considered dangerous. In response, they drafted rules with precision and authority. This particular law addressed a specific behavior that seemed critical to control, something that at the time could have influenced stability or morality. Initially, people complied, whether out of fear of punishment, respect for authority, or simply habit. Courts and officials referred to it sporadically, and at the moment of its creation, it seemed effective. But history, as always, moves forward, indifferent to the intentions of lawmakers. Time gradually revealed the limitations of the law. Society evolved. New priorities emerged. Practices once seen as threatening became ordinary. Technology, trade, and cultural shifts rendered the law increasingly irrelevant. Yet, despite the world changing around it, the law remained unchanged, an artifact of a bygone era. Enforcement became sporadic, awkward, and eventually non-existent. Officials no longer cited it, judges avoided it, and the population stopped regarding it seriously. Over time, the law transitioned from being an active guideline to a historical curiosity, a written remnant with no practical application. The law's survival depended on collective inattention. It was ignored universally. Citizens did not organize to break it, nor did they actively defy it. They simply went about their lives as if it did not exist. Officials, recognizing the futility of enforcement, also turned away. Over time, this shared neglect became habitual. Pretending the law was irrelevant became routine. Habit turned into tradition,
and tradition solidified its invisibility. For generations, society coexisted with this law without acknowledging its presence, illustrating the gap between legal authority and social reality. As centuries passed, the law's existence became more symbolic than functional. Historians and legal researchers eventually encountered it while combing through archives, and their initial reactions were disbelief. How could a law remain legally valid for hundreds of years while being universally ignored? The answer highlighted the complexities of human governance. Laws are not merely formalities, they rely on relevance, belief, and enforcement to hold power. When these elements disappear, a law may exist on paper but wield no practical authority. Officials faced a dilemma upon rediscovery. Enforcing the law would have been absurd, punishing generations of people who had unknowingly disregarded it. Ignoring it further, however, might have implied negligence or incompetence. The law had trapped the system in a paradox. It existed in theory, but not in practice. The solution was simple: remove it quietly. With minimal discussion and no fanfare, the law was repealed. A process that took centuries to exist ended in minutes. This quiet abolition did not change society, because society had long since adapted to a world in which the law was irrelevant. Its repeal was a formality, acknowledging a reality that had been true for generations. The story of this forgotten law teaches lessons about authority, obedience, and human behavior. Laws are not immortal. They endure only when they remain relevant. People do not follow rules blindly. They follow rules that resonate with their lived experience. Silence and neglect can achieve what formal rebellion or reform might never accomplish. For 300 years, the law existed but held no practical influence. Generations of people complied with other laws but ignored this one, demonstrating that authority requires both recognition and relevance. Human pragmatism explains much of the law's survival and eventual obsolescence. People are not naturally rebellious, but they are practical. When enforcing a rule becomes absurd, societies often find ways to circumvent or ignore it. The law existed in records, yet daily life moved on without incident. Citizens ignored it without consequence. Officials disregarded it without fear. By acting as though it did not exist, society maintained stability and order, arguably more effectively than strict enforcement would have allowed. The law's story also highlights an often overlooked aspect of history. Not all change is dramatic or marked by visible acts. Some of the most instructive moments in history emerge from what is ignored, avoided, or silently subverted. Over centuries, collective neglect rendered the law inert. The quiet inaction of individuals and officials nullified a legal decree without confrontation. Inaction, in this context, is a form of power, shaping outcomes as profoundly as legislation or rebellion might. When the law was finally repealed, the act itself was understated. It had no immediate effect on daily life because society had long since internalized its irrelevance. However, the formal repeal served as a symbolic acknowledgement of the centuries-long reality. The law had failed silently long before its official abolition, and its end was merely an official recognition of that fact. The story emphasizes that authority does not rely solely on legal texts, but on social acknowledgement, enforcement, and the alignment of law with lived experience. The forgotten law also offers insight into the resilience and adaptability of bureaucratic systems. Institutions can maintain rules that are obsolete without collapse. Legal frameworks balance rigidity with flexibility, allowing neglect to coexist with stability. The law's survival, despite universal inattention, demonstrates how systems manage irrelevance without breaking. Functionality in governance often depends more on practical adaptation than rigid adherence to written rules. This law challenges assumptions about the nature of compliance and authority. Presence does not guarantee obedience. Validity does not ensure relevance. Societies can operate successfully even when written rules are ignored, provided there is shared understanding and adaptation. The history of this law illustrates the complex, negotiated relationship between authority and social behavior. Obedience is dynamic. It is earned through relevance, not simply demanded through decree. Furthermore, the story of the law underscores the subtlety of historical impact. Not all influence is loud, visible, or revolutionary. The slow erosion of relevance, combined with collective neglect, can produce outcomes as significant as any public revolt. For 3 centuries, a law existed on paper but was powerless in practice. Its invisibility, born from shared inaction, shaped the lived reality of generations. The absence of enforcement, the quiet disobedience of ordinary citizens, and the non-interference of officials collectively created historical consequences far beyond what the lawmakers had intended. The law serves as a metaphor for the fragile relationship between written authority and human agency. It illustrates that power depends on more than mere formal existence. For authority to be effective, it must resonate with the realities and beliefs of those it governs. Without relevance, even the most meticulously written law can become meaningless. Compliance is not automatic. It is negotiated, often silently, between rulers and the ruled. The forgotten law is an enduring example of how neglect can undermine authority without confrontation. Over centuries, the law became a reflection of social pragmatism. Citizens acted according to their needs, ignoring outdated rules. Officials prioritized practical governance over strict adherence to irrelevance. In doing so, society maintained order not through enforcement, but through adaptation. Stability arose from collective understanding rather than coercion. The law, though valid on paper, became a testament to the subtle ways humans navigate authority and maintain equilibrium. Ultimately, the law's story teaches enduring lessons about governance, relevance, and human behavior. Laws survive when they remain.
Throughout history, there have been countless laws that were written with great urgency, intended to maintain order and influence human behavior. Yet some of these laws outlived their relevance and quietly faded from active enforcement. One such law endured for centuries, surviving not because it was enforced, but because it was forgotten. When it was created, authority depended heavily on the written word, and lawmakers believed that permanence on paper would translate into permanence in society. A signature, a seal, and an official declaration were considered sufficient to guarantee obedience. The assumption seemed logical at the time, but as time passed, it became evident that permanence is only meaningful when reality aligns with the written word. The law emerged in an era of anxiety and social concern. Leaders were worried about disorder, immorality, or behaviors they deemed dangerous.
In response, they drafted rules with exacting detail, believing these rules would secure stability and compliance. This particular law targeted a specific behavior that at the time was seen as critical to control. Initially, it commanded attention and compliance. People followed it, whether out of fear, respect, or habit, and it appeared to function as intended. For the first years of its existence, the law carried authority and relevance, shaping the conduct of society in subtle and direct ways. However, as time progressed, society changed faster than the law could adapt. Cultural norms shifted, technology transformed everyday life, and behaviors once considered problematic became ordinary. Practices that had seemed dangerous or disruptive gradually disappeared or lost significance. The law, however, remained frozen in the context of its creation. Enforcement became increasingly sporadic, awkward, and eventually ceased altogether. Courts and officials stopped citing it, while citizens largely ignored its existence. What was once a rule of immediate relevance became a historical relic, an artifact whose original purpose had evaporated. The law's continued existence relied entirely on collective neglect. Society, officials, and institutions universally ignored it, but not out of rebellion. Rather, it was a pragmatic response to the absurdity of enforcement. Generations grew up unaware of its presence, living entire lifetimes as if the law did not exist. Officials recognized the impracticality of applying it and chose inaction over enforcement. Over decades and centuries, this habitual neglect became normalized. Pretending the law was irrelevant became routine, and this routine solidified its invisibility within the social and administrative framework. By the time centuries had passed, the law existed legally but had no practical effect on anyone's life. When historians and legal researchers eventually discovered the law in archival documents, their initial reaction was disbelief. How could a law exist formally for hundreds of years while being universally ignored? How had society functioned while technically violating a rule for generations? The legal texts were clear. The law was still valid. Yet the lived reality was that it had been ignored for centuries without consequence. This paradox revealed fundamental truths about the nature of law, authority, and compliance. Laws are effective only when they align with social behavior and public acknowledgement. Absent relevance, obedience, or enforcement, laws lose their practical power. Officials confronted a dilemma upon rediscovery. Enforcing the law would have been absurd, punishing generations for actions that had long ceased to be socially problematic. Ignoring it further risked exposing institutional negligence. The law had trapped authorities in a peculiar situation. It existed in theory, but had no practical effect. The resolution was straightforward: quietly repeal it. With a short discussion, a vote, and a signature, the law that had survived for centuries was formally abolished. No public announcement, no ceremony, no upheaval occurred. The society it governed had long since adapted to its irrelevance, and the repeal merely acknowledged what reality had already established. The law's history provides important lessons about governance, authority, and human behavior. Laws are not eternal. They endure only when they remain relevant to the people they govern. Obedience is not automatic. Individuals follow rules that make sense in their lived reality. Silence and neglect can nullify laws as effectively as public protest or legal amendment. 3 centuries of universal inaction effectively eliminated the law's influence, demonstrating that authority depends on recognition and social alignment rather than formal existence alone. Human pragmatism explains much of the law's longevity and ultimate obsolescence. People are not inherently rebellious, but they are practical. When rules become outdated or absurd, societies often adapt by ignoring them. The law existed in records, yet the world continued without interruption. Citizens acted as though it did not exist, and officials prioritized functional governance over adherence to irrelevance. This pragmatic adaptation maintained social order more effectively than strict enforcement might have achieved. The law's presence in text did not define its practical significance. Human behavior did. This forgotten law also underscores the subtlety of historical influence. History often remembers dramatic events, wars, revolutions, declarations, but some of the most significant changes occur quietly through neglect and inaction. Over centuries, the law was rendered inert by shared inattention. Ordinary people living ordinary lives and officials choosing not to enforce outdated rules collectively nullified a legal decree without conflict. Inaction, in this context, became a force capable of shaping historical outcomes as powerfully as any formal legislation or public uprising. The law's eventual repeal was understated, almost invisible. Society had long since internalized its irrelevance, so the formal abolition did not disrupt daily life. Yet the repeal symbolized an acknowledgement of centuries-long reality. The law had failed silently long before official action. Its enduring lesson is that authority requires relevance, belief, and recognition. Without these, even the most formally valid law becomes meaningless. This story also highlights the adaptability and resilience of bureaucratic systems. Institutions can sustain outdated rules without collapse, balancing rigidity and flexibility. The law's survival, despite centuries of universal neglect, demonstrates how systems manage irrelevance while maintaining stability. Governance depends on functional adaptation more than strict adherence to every written word. Inaction, selective attention, and practical enforcement are often more effective than rigid compliance. The law challenges conventional assumptions about compliance and authority. Legal presence alone does not ensure obedience, and validity does not guarantee relevance. Societies can function successfully when written rules are ignored, provided shared understanding and adaptation guide behavior. The history of this law illustrates a dynamic, negotiated relationship between authority and social behavior. Obedience is earned, contingent, and maintained through context, not by decree alone. Furthermore, the law demonstrates the power of subtlety in shaping history. Not all impact is dramatic, visible, or revolutionary. The slow erosion of relevance, combined with universal neglect, produced outcomes as significant as any public revolt. For 3 centuries, the law existed on paper, but had no real-world effect. Its invisibility, produced by collective inaction, shaped social reality more profoundly than any enforcement could have achieved. The law also serves as a metaphor for the fragile interplay between written authority and human agency. Power and control depend not only on formal validity, but also on social acknowledgement. Without relevance, authority is an empty formality. Compliance is not automatic. It emerges from negotiation between rulers and the ruled, influenced by practical needs, cultural norms, and shared understanding. The forgotten law exemplifies how invisibility and neglect can undermine authority without direct confrontation. Over centuries, human pragmatism guided the law's survival and irrelevance. Citizens ignored it because it no longer affected their lives. Officials prioritized functional governance over rigid enforcement. By acting as if the law did not exist, society maintained stability, equilibrium, and order. The law's presence in records became secondary to the lived realities of the people it supposedly governed. Its continued existence, legally intact yet socially irrelevant, highlights the ways humans navigate authority through adaptation rather than confrontation. Ultimately, the law teaches enduring lessons about relevance, authority, and human behavior. Laws endure only when they align with context, culture, and social needs. Authority holds meaning only when it resonates with lived experience. Silence, neglect, and adaptation can shape history as effectively as legislation, enforcement, or rebellion. The 3 centuries during which the law was ignored demonstrate the transformative power of inaction.
Throughout human history, countless laws have been created with urgency, intent, and authority, yet some of these laws outlived their practical relevance and quietly faded from enforcement. One such law existed for centuries, surviving not because it was respected, enforced, or acknowledged, but because it was forgotten. When it was first drafted, authority was heavily dependent on the written word. Lawmakers believed that permanence on paper would translate directly into permanence in society. A signature, a seal, and a formal decree were considered sufficient to guarantee compliance. At the time, this assumption seemed entirely reasonable. The written law was seen as a tool of power, a reflection of societal control, and a measure of stability. Yet, as centuries unfolded, it became evident that permanence on paper is meaningless without practical relevance. The law was created during a time of uncertainty and concern. Leaders feared social disorder, moral decay, and behaviors they considered dangerous or destabilizing. In response, they crafted a rule with precise language and strict guidelines. This particular law targeted a specific human behavior that was perceived as threatening to social cohesion. Initially, the law carried weight. People complied, not always out of agreement, but out of fear, respect, or habit. Courts occasionally referenced it, and officials acknowledged its existence in their decisions. For a short period, it had influence and authority, shaping behavior and maintaining order. But history, as it often does, moved forward faster than lawmakers anticipated. As decades passed, the society around the law transformed. Technology altered communication and commerce. Cultural norms shifted. Behaviors once considered dangerous became ordinary. The circumstances that justified the law gradually disappeared. Yet the law itself remained unchanged, a relic frozen in time. Enforcement became sporadic and awkward. Officials found applying it impractical, while judges hesitated to interpret it. Citizens gradually stopped noticing it. Over time, the law shifted from being an active instrument of governance to a dormant artifact, legally valid but socially irrelevant. The law's endurance relied on collective neglect. It was universally ignored, but not through rebellion. Instead, it was overlooked as a matter of practicality. Citizens did not organize to break it, nor did they actively oppose it. They simply lived as if it did not exist. Officials recognized the futility of enforcement and opted for inaction. Generations grew up without awareness of its existence. Over centuries, this habit of ignoring the law became normalized. Pretending it did not exist became routine, and this routine cemented its invisibility in both public consciousness and bureaucratic administration. Legally, it survived, but in the lived experience of society, it was irrelevant. When historians eventually discovered the law in archival research, their reactions were disbelief and curiosity. How could a rule survive in formal legal texts for centuries without any practical effect?
How had society functioned while technically violating it for generations? The texts were clear, the law remained valid, yet in practice it had been ignored for hundreds of years. This paradox illustrates fundamental truths about law, governance, and human behavior. Laws exist not only as formal structures, but also as social instruments. Their power depends on enforcement, relevance, and public acknowledgement. Without these, even the most formally binding rules are powerless. Authorities who discovered the law faced an unusual dilemma. Enforcing it would have been absurd, punishing generations of people for behaviors that had long been socially accepted. Ignoring it further might have implied negligence or incompetence. The law had trapped the system in a paradox, valid in theory, powerless in practice. The solution was straightforward: repeal it quietly. With minimal discussion, a short vote, and a signature, the law that had endured for centuries was formally abolished. There was no ceremony, no public announcement, no disruption. Society had already adapted to a world in which the law had long been irrelevant, and the repeal only formalized what reality had established generations ago. The history of this law offers profound lessons about governance, compliance, and human behavior. Laws are not eternal. They endure only as long as they remain relevant to the people they govern. Obedience is not automatic. Individuals comply with rules that make sense within their daily lives. Silence and neglect can nullify laws as effectively as protests, amendments, or formal abolitions. 3 centuries of universal inaction effectively eliminated the law's influence, showing that authority relies on acknowledgement and social alignment rather than written existence alone. Human pragmatism explains much of the law's survival and eventual obsolescence. People are practical rather than rebellious. When enforcing a rule becomes absurd or disruptive, societies adapt by ignoring it. The law existed in archives, but daily life continued uninterrupted. Citizens acted as if it did not exist, and officials prioritized practical governance over strict adherence. This approach maintained order and stability more effectively than enforcing a rule that had lost its relevance. The law's physical presence in texts mattered less than the behaviors, adaptations, and shared understanding of the people it was meant to govern. The forgotten law also demonstrates the subtlety of historical influence. Dramatic events, revolutions, and wars dominate narratives, but some of the most instructive moments in history occur quietly. Collective neglect can achieve outcomes as significant as protests, enforcement, or rebellion. For centuries, ordinary people, officials, and institutions all acted as if the law did not exist, effectively nullifying it without any overt confrontation. Inaction, in this sense, is a form of influence and power, shaping the lived experience of society as much as deliberate intervention. The eventual repeal of the law was understated. Society had long internalized its irrelevance, so the formal abolition caused no disruption. Yet the repeal symbolized recognition of centuries-long reality. The law had failed silently long before official action, and its removal merely acknowledged a truth that had been evident for generations. Its history highlights that authority requires relevance, enforcement, and acknowledgement. Without these, even the most formally valid rule becomes meaningless. The story of this law also illustrates the resilience and adaptability of bureaucratic systems. Institutions can maintain outdated rules without collapsing. Legal frameworks balance rigidity with flexibility, accommodating neglect while preserving overall stability. The law's survival, despite universal inattention, demonstrates how systems handle irrelevance without disruption. Effective governance depends on adaptation, selective attention, and practical judgment more than rigid adherence to formal rules. This law challenges conventional assumptions about compliance and authority. The existence of a rule does not ensure obedience. Legal validity does not guarantee relevance. Societies function effectively when certain rules are ignored, as long as shared understanding and adaptation guide behavior. The history of this law exemplifies the negotiated and dynamic relationship between authority and social conduct. Obedience is contingent, maintained through recognition and relevance rather than coercion alone. The story further underscores the significance of subtle forces in history. Not all historical influence is loud, visible, or revolutionary. The slow erosion of relevance, combined with widespread neglect, can produce outcomes as significant as public revolts or legislative reform. For centuries, a law existed on paper but was powerless in practice. Its invisibility, produced by the collective choices of individuals and institutions, shaped society more profoundly than enforcement ever could. The law illustrates how inaction, neglect, and silence can drive historical change. The law also serves as a metaphor for the delicate balance between authority and human agency. Power and compliance rely not only on formal validity, but also on social acknowledgement, relevance, and shared understanding. Without these, authority is hollow. Compliance is earned, negotiated, and maintained through the alignment of law with lived experience. The forgotten law exemplifies how invisibility and collective neglect can undermine formal authority without open confrontation. Over centuries, human pragmatism guided the law's survival and irrelevance. Citizens ignored it because it had lost relevance, and officials prioritized functional governance over strict adherence. By acting as though the law did not exist, society maintained order, stability, and equilibrium. Its presence in records was secondary to practical behavior and societal adaptation. This dynamic demonstrates how humans navigate authority through practical choices rather than mere obedience. Ultimately, the forgotten law provides lasting lessons about relevance, authority, and social behavior. Laws endure only when they align with societal needs, culture, and context. Authority is meaningful only when acknowledged and applicable. Silence, neglect, and adaptation can influence history as effectively as legislation, enforcement, or rebellion. 3 centuries of collective inaction.
In the vast archives of human history, there exist countless laws that were once considered essential, urgent, and unyielding. Yet over time, many of these laws lost their relevance and faded into obscurity. One such law endured quietly for centuries, surviving not because it was enforced, respected, or widely acknowledged, but simply because it was forgotten. When the law was first established, society depended heavily on the written word as the ultimate instrument of authority. Lawmakers assumed that a law, once documented, sealed, and formally declared, would automatically shape human behavior indefinitely. At the time of its creation, the law held weight. Citizens complied, motivated by fear of punishment, respect for authority, or habit. Courts referenced it, officials considered it, and it influenced social behavior, at least initially. For a period, it had relevance and authority, shaping conduct in subtle but meaningful ways. Yet history, as it inevitably does, moved forward, changing the context in which the law existed. Over time, society evolved, cultural norms shifted, technologies emerged, commerce transformed daily life, and behaviors once viewed as problematic became ordinary. The specific circumstances that gave rise to the law gradually disappeared.
Meanwhile, the law itself remained unchanged, frozen in the context of its creation. Enforcement became increasingly rare and awkward. Officials found applying it impractical, judges hesitated to interpret it, and citizens gradually stopped noticing it. The law transitioned from an active tool of governance to a dormant relic, legally valid but socially irrelevant. Its power, dependent on acknowledgement and practice, had faded, leaving behind a mere shadow in the archives. The law's survival relied entirely on collective neglect. Citizens, officials, and institutions universally ignored it, not out of defiance, but out of pragmatism. Society understood, consciously or unconsciously, that enforcing the law would be absurd and disruptive. Generations grew up without knowledge of the law, living entire lives as though it did not exist. Officials chose inaction over enforcement, recognizing that attempting to apply the law would create more chaos than compliance. Over centuries, this shared habit of ignoring the law became normalized. Pretending it did not exist became routine, and routine solidified its invisibility. Legally, the law endured, but socially and practically it had vanished. Historians and legal scholars eventually rediscovered the law while examining archival documents. Their initial reaction was disbelief. How could a rule remain formally valid for centuries while being universally ignored? How had society functioned while technically violating it for generations? The texts were clear. The law remained in force, yet in practice it had been disregarded for hundreds of years. This paradox reveals fundamental truths about authority, law, and human behavior. Laws are not powerful in isolation. Their effectiveness depends on relevance, enforcement, and acknowledgement by those they govern. Absent these elements, even the most formally binding rules are impotent. Authorities faced a difficult dilemma upon rediscovery. Enforcing the law would have been absurd, punishing countless people for behavior that had long ceased to be socially problematic. Ignoring it further risked exposing institutional incompetence. The law had trapped officials in a peculiar paradox. It existed theoretically, but was powerless practically. The only reasonable solution was quiet repeal. With minimal discussion, a vote, and a signature, the law that had survived for centuries was formally abolished. There was no public announcement, no ceremony, and no disruption. Society had long since adapted to a world in which the law no longer mattered, and the repeal only formalized what had already existed in practice. The history of this law offers lessons about governance, compliance, and human behavior. Laws are not eternal. They endure only as long as they remain relevant to the society they regulate. Obedience is not automatic. It arises from rules that make sense within lived experience. Silence and neglect can nullify laws as effectively as formal repeal, protest, or amendment. 3 centuries of universal inaction effectively eliminated the law's power, demonstrating that authority relies not only on formal existence, but also on social alignment and practical relevance. Human pragmatism explains much of the law's survival and eventual obsolescence. People are rarely rebellious by nature, but they are practical. When a law becomes outdated or enforcement is absurd, societies adapt by ignoring it. The law existed in records, yet life continued uninterrupted. Citizens acted as though it did not exist, and officials prioritized practical governance over rigid enforcement. This pragmatic adaptation maintained stability more effectively than strict compliance ever could have. The law's presence on paper mattered less than the behavior and adaptations of those it was intended to govern. This forgotten law also illustrates the subtlety of historical influence. History often remembers dramatic events, revolutions, and conflicts, but some of the most profound shifts occur quietly. collective neglect can produce outcomes as significant as deliberate enforcement or rebellion. For centuries, ordinary people and officials acted as if the law did not exist, effectively nullifying it without confrontation. Inaction, in this sense, is a potent force, shaping the lived reality of society as decisively as legislation or public uprising. The eventual repeal of the law was understated. Society had long since internalized its irrelevance, so the formal abolition caused no disruption. Yet the repeal symbolized acknowledgement of centuries-long reality. The law had already failed silently long before its official removal, and the repeal simply recognized what had already existed in practice. This forgotten law illustrates the subtlety of historical influence. Not all impact is loud, visible, or revolutionary. The gradual erosion of relevance, combined with collective neglect, produced outcomes as significant as deliberate enforcement or legal reform. For centuries, the law existed in paper but had no practical effect. Its invisibility, shaped by the collective choices of individuals and institutions, profoundly influenced society. The law demonstrates that inaction, silence, and pragmatic adaptation can wield as much historical power as active enforcement. The law serves as a metaphor for the delicate balance between authority and human agency. Power depends not only on formal validity, but also on social acknowledgement, relevance, and shared understanding. Without these, authority is hollow. Compliance is earned, negotiated, and maintained through alignment with lived experience. The forgotten law exemplifies how invisibility and collective neglect can undermine authority without confrontation. Over centuries, human pragmatism guided the law's survival and irrelevance. Citizens ignored it because it no longer mattered. Officials prioritized functional governance over strict enforcement. Acting as if the law did not exist allowed society to maintain order, stability, and equilibrium. The law's presence in archives was secondary to the lived behaviors of those it governed. Its endurance illustrates the ways humans navigate authority through practical adaptation rather than blind obedience. Ultimately, the law provides enduring lessons about relevance, authority, and social behavior. Laws endure only when they align with context, culture, and societal needs. Authority is meaningful only when acknowledged and applicable. Silence, neglect, and adaptation can shape history as effectively as legislation, enforcement, or rebellion. 3 centuries of universal inaction effectively eliminated the law's power, demonstrating that authority relies not only on formal existence, but also on social alignment and practical relevance. Reflecting on this forgotten law, it becomes clear that governance depends not only on written statutes, but also on the alignment of authority with lived experience. Compliance, order, and control are maintained through recognition, shared understanding, and practical relevance. Laws that outlive their context lose effectiveness, becoming historical artifacts rather than tools of governance. Yet, even as artifacts, they provide invaluable insight into human behavior, illustrating how societies balance authority with adaptation. Through silence, pragmatism, and practical judgment, societies sustain order while discarding irrelevance, revealing the hidden mechanisms shaping historical continuity and change.
For centuries, societies believed that laws were permanent anchors, fixed points that held order in place no matter how much the world around them shifted. Once written, stamped, and declared, a law was assumed to possess an almost timeless authority. But history quietly proves otherwise. One particular law survived not through strength or relevance, but through absence. It lingered for hundreds of years, untouched and unchallenged, because no one remembered to question it.
When it was created, it addressed a fear that once felt urgent and unavoidable. At the time, lawmakers were responding to a specific social anxiety, one that reflected the values, limitations, and assumptions of that era. The law made sense then, or at least it felt necessary. Yet necessity is a fragile thing. It fades when the conditions that produced it disappear. At the moment of its creation, the law was treated seriously. It shaped behavior, guided decisions, and influenced how people interacted with one another. Enforcement existed, though imperfect, and people adjusted their lives accordingly. The law became part of the background of society, rarely discussed but quietly obeyed. Over time, however, the world began to change in ways the original lawmakers could never have predicted. New technologies altered communication, economic systems evolved, cultural attitudes shifted. Behaviors once seen as dangerous, immoral, or disruptive became ordinary and accepted. The law, however, remained frozen in its original wording, bound to a past that no longer existed. As decades passed, the law became increasingly awkward to apply. Officials encountered situations where enforcing it felt unreasonable or even absurd. Judges hesitated, sensing that strict application would contradict contemporary values. Enforcement slowed, then stopped entirely. There was no public announcement explaining this change, no declaration of repeal. Instead, a quiet understanding emerged. Ignoring the law became easier than enforcing it. Silence replaced authority, and habit replaced obedience. Over time, people stopped thinking about the law altogether. Generations were born and raised without ever hearing of it. Entire lives unfolded in complete violation of a rule that still technically existed. The law did not inspire fear or respect because it inspired nothing at all. It had slipped beyond awareness. In this way, the law entered a strange state of existence. It was alive on paper, but dead in practice. It occupied space in legal archives, but held no place in daily life. This condition persisted for centuries, sustained by collective neglect rather than deliberate rebellion. What makes this story remarkable is not that the law was ignored, but that it was ignored universally. There were no rebels fighting against it, no activists demanding its removal, no public debates questioning its legitimacy. Everyone simply acted as though it no longer existed. Officials avoided it, citizens forgot it, institutions moved on without formally addressing it. This silent agreement between authority and society was never spoken aloud, yet it proved incredibly powerful. Without confrontation or conflict, the law lost all influence. Eventually, historians and legal researchers rediscovered the law while examining old documents. At first, they assumed it had been repealed long ago. Such outdated rules usually are. But when they searched for records of repeal, they found none. The law, astonishingly, was still valid. This realization revealed an uncomfortable truth. For hundreds of years, society had functioned in open violation of a standing law, and nothing had happened. Order had not collapsed. Morality had not eroded. In fact, society had arguably improved. This discovery forced officials to confront a paradox. Enforcing the law was impossible. Doing so would criminalize normal behavior and undermine public trust. Ignoring it any longer risked exposing a failure of oversight. The law had become an embarrassment, a symbol of how authority can drift away from reality. The solution was quiet and efficient. With minimal attention, the law was formally repealed. No speeches were given, no public celebrations occurred. Life continued exactly as it had the day before. The law's story highlights a fundamental truth about power. Authority does not come from words alone. It comes from relevance, recognition, and shared belief. A law without enforcement is not a law in practice. It is a historical artifact. The centuries-long neglect of this rule demonstrates that people obey laws not because they exist, but because they make sense within their lived experience. When that sense disappears, obedience dissolves naturally. This forgotten law also challenges the assumption that change must be loud to be effective. History often focuses on revolutions, protests, and dramatic reforms, but here change occurred through inaction. Silence achieved what confrontation never did. Over centuries, people collectively decided, without discussion or coordination, that the law no longer mattered. That decision reshaped reality more effectively than any formal repeal could have at the time. This story also reveals the flexibility of social systems. Bureaucracies are often criticized for being rigid, yet this example shows their capacity for quiet adaptation. By choosing not to enforce an outdated rule, officials preserved stability. By choosing not to question it, citizens preserved normalcy. Together, these choices allowed society to evolve without disruption. The law's continued existence on paper was irrelevant compared to the lived reality shaped by human behavior. The law ultimately became more valuable as a lesson than it ever was as a regulation. It illustrates the limits of written authority and the power of collective behavior. It shows that societies are not governed solely by documents, but by shared understanding and practical judgment. A rule can survive for centuries and still mean nothing. Conversely, a rule can disappear from practice long before it disappears from text. This story also raises important questions about how many other forgotten laws exist, quietly lingering in archives, technically valid, yet completely ignored. These dormant rules reveal gaps between governance and reality. They remind us that law is a living system, one that requires attention, adaptation, and relevance to remain meaningful. Without these, it becomes symbolic rather than functional. The forgotten law serves as a reminder that compliance is not automatic. It must be maintained through alignment with social values and lived experience. People are not naturally disobedient, but they are practical. When a law conflicts with reality, practicality wins. This quiet prioritization of function over form allowed society to progress while leaving outdated authority behind. In the end, the law's disappearance was not marked by conflict, but by acknowledgement. Its repeal did not change how people lived because people had already moved on. The formal act merely caught up with reality. This gap between written authority and lived experience reveals the true nature of power. Power exists where belief, relevance, and practice align. Without them, even the oldest laws become invisible. The legacy of this forgotten rule is not found in punishment or enforcement, but in understanding. It teaches that silence can reshape systems, that neglect can dismantle authority, and that relevance is the true source of power. The law did not fail because people were disobedient. It failed because it no longer belonged to the world it was trying to control. And in that failure, it left behind a quiet but powerful lesson about how societies truly function. There was a time when people believed that once a rule was written into law, it would shape behavior forever. Ink on paper felt stronger than memory, stronger than habit, stronger than time itself. One particular law was created with that exact belief in mind. It was written carefully, debated seriously, and approved with confidence. The people who created it assumed that future generations would obey it simply because it existed. They could not imagine a world where the law would remain technically alive while completely absent from daily life. Yet that is exactly what happened. When the law was first introduced, it reflected the fears and priorities of its age. Society was anxious about control, order, and predictability. Leaders believed that without strict rules, chaos would emerge. The law targeted a behavior that seemed dangerous at the time, something authorities believed could undermine stability or morality. For years, the law worked as intended. People adjusted their actions, enforcement occurred occasionally, and the rule became part of the invisible structure guiding daily life. It did not need constant reminders because everyone understood it, or at least accepted it. But history does not pause to respect written authority. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the conditions that gave meaning to the law began to disappear. Economic systems evolved. Social values shifted. Technology altered how people lived, worked, and communicated. Behaviors that once seemed threatening became harmless or even beneficial. The law, however, remained unchanged. Its words stayed exactly as they were on the day they were written, locked into a reality that no longer existed. At first, enforcement became inconsistent. Officials hesitated, unsure whether applying the law still made sense. Judges interpreted it narrowly, often avoiding it entirely. Over time, enforcement stopped altogether. There was no announcement explaining why, no formal acknowledgement that the law no longer fit modern life. It simply faded from practice. People continued living their lives, unknowingly violating a rule that no longer had any impact on them. What followed was not rebellion, but forgetfulness. Children grew up without learning about the law. Adults lived full lives without ever encountering it. Institutions functioned perfectly well without referencing it. The law slipped out of collective awareness, becoming invisible rather than contested. It still existed in legal records, but those records were rarely consulted. The law entered a strange limbo, preserved by paperwork, but erased by habit. For generations, society operated in complete contradiction to the written rule, and nothing collapsed. There was no breakdown of order, no moral decay, no crisis that could be traced back to the law's neglect. In fact, society adapted and improved. This silent success raised an uncomfortable question. If ignoring a law causes no harm, was the law ever truly necessary? Or was it only necessary for a moment in history that no longer mattered? Eventually, researchers examining old legal documents stumbled upon the forgotten rule. At first, it seemed like a curiosity, a relic from a distant past. But deeper investigation revealed something surprising. The law had never been repealed. It was still technically valid. This discovery created quiet shock among scholars and officials alike. The realization that an entire society had ignored a standing law for centuries challenged fundamental assumptions about authority and governance. Officials faced an awkward dilemma. Enforcing the law would be irrational and damaging. Ignoring it any longer would expose a failure to maintain legal clarity. The law had become a symbol of disconnection between written authority and lived reality. The solution was swift and understated. The law was formally repealed through a simple administrative process. No public debate followed because none was needed. Society had already moved on long ago. The repeal changed nothing in daily life, and that was the point. The law had lost its power centuries earlier, not through defiance, but through irrelevance. This story demonstrates that authority depends more than documentation. A law survives only when people believe in its purpose and see its value reflected in their lives. Without that connection, authority dissolves quietly. The forgotten law also reveals how change happens without drama. History tends to highlight moments of conflict and confrontation, but some of the most significant transformations occur through silence. No one organized against this law. No one demanded its removal. People simply stopped caring. That collective indifference reshaped reality more effectively than any protest could have. This quiet process exposes the human tendency toward practicality. People obey rules that help them function within their world. When a rule no longer serves that function, it is naturally abandoned. This is not rebellion, it is adaptation. Over time, adaptation becomes tradition, and tradition becomes normal. The law's words remained, but their meaning dissolved. The story also challenges the idea that systems are rigid and unchanging. In practice, systems are flexible, shaped by the choices of individuals within them. Officials chose not to enforce the law. Citizens chose not to acknowledge it. Together, these choices transformed the legal landscape without rewriting a single sentence. The written rule became irrelevant because human behavior moved beyond it. This forgotten law now serves as a lesson rather than a regulation. It shows that power cannot be maintained through text alone. Authority requires relevance, trust, and shared understanding. Without these elements, even the oldest and most formally valid laws become empty symbols. The law did not fail because people disobeyed it. It failed because it no longer belonged to the world it tried to govern. The existence of such laws raises an unsettling possibility. How many other laws still exist quietly, technically valid, yet completely ignored? These dormant laws reveal the gap between governance and reality. They remind us that law is not static. It must evolve or risk becoming invisible. Written authority must be revisited, questioned, and adapted, or it loses its connection to the people it is meant to serve. In the end, the forgotten law teaches a simple but powerful truth. Power does not come from permanence, it comes from relevance. A rule that no one remembers has no power, no matter how old or official it may be. The centuries-long silence surrounding this law speaks louder than any enforcement ever could. It shows that societies are guided not only by what is written, but by what is lived, practiced, and understood. Through neglect rather than resistance, this law was erased from reality long before it was erased from paper. Its story is not of failure, but of transformation. It reveals how human behavior quietly reshapes authority, how relevance determines obedience, and how history is often written not by dramatic action, but by collective silence.